Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Most of the world's countries are associated in people's minds with a certain period in their history. Invariably, these periods are years long. For Vietnam and Yugoslavia, it's the terrible wars in those countries in the 1960s and 1990s. For South Africa, it's the scourge of apartheid, which of course lasted for decades. But for Rwanda, a tiny country in Central Africa, the episode burnt into people's collective memory is 3 months in 1994, when perhaps 750,000 Rwandans were killed in a dreadful genocide. The manner in which the genocide has been remembered inside Rwanda is oversimplistic and incomplete. And for this, one man can be blamed more than any other. Paul Kagame, Rwanda's effective leader since the genocide, has centralised power around himself, painting him as the man who stopped the terrible events of 1994 in their tracks, and telling Rwandans that only he can bring stability to a country that in most of our lifetimes tore itself apart in the worst way imaginable. As my guest today tells us, this is not only fatuous, but worse, the West believes Kagame. Kagame is seen as a reliable ally of the governments in Washington and London. The West has chosen not to delve into the conflicting narratives surrounding the genocide, and lazily believes the one that suits their interest best. That Kagame, whilst a little rough around the edges, is a consummate stabilitocrat. He wouldn't hurt a fly. A person perhaps, but as long as he doesn't present problems for them, they're willing to turn the other cheek. That's what Kagame teaches us about world politics, the terrible consequences of a lack of political will. That however many times the British and Americans say that somebody is the lesser of two evils, or we have no choice but to support them, the West is itself making choices, not to stand up for the things we claim to believe in. My guest for today's conversation is Michaela Wrong, a British journalist and author who focuses on Africa, previously working as a foreign correspondent for Reuters, the BBC and the Financial Times. Her recent book, Do Not Disturb, details the lengths to which Kagame has gone to remain in power. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Paul Kagame. Hi Michaela, how are you?
I'm fine.
Michaela, we're talking about Paul Kagame today. He has been the president of Rwanda since 2000, and I think many would argue he has been the effective leader of Rwanda for longer than that. Kagame was born in 1957, and his early life, in many ways his entire life, have been defined by events that happened when he was only 2 years old. Can you go into what happened in Rwanda in the late 1950s, just to set this talk up?
Yes, I'm happy to. Firstly, we should probably describe what Rwanda was in the 19th century when the German explorers first discovered this kingdom. It was a hilly, very beautiful little kingdom in the heart of Central Africa. And it was a kingdom run by the Mwami, the king. And it was a kingdom which had a very clear delineation. And some people will argue about whether or not that delineation is ethnic or whether it's actually socioeconomic. But basically, it was a delineation between the Tutsi aristocracy, who were clustered around the king, they were both cattle herders of these beautiful Ankole cattle that you get in that part of the world, but they also made up the warrior caste and they made up the army. And then as a kind of serf caste below them, there were the Hutu who outnumbered the Tutsis, and the Hutus were the farmers and did the sort of hard grind of growing crops and were not allowed to own cattle unless they were sort of making a transition into the Tutsi community. So it was very clearly delineated, and people remarked on it at the time. There were many changes. The outside world impacted on Rwanda. Rwanda, after the First World War, it became eventually a Belgian colony. And what you see is the reversal in the 1960s with the Tutsi aristocracy, the monarchy being overturned, and Hutus coming to power with the encouragement and approval of the Belgian colonizing administration. And in something that was known as Muyaga, the wind of destruction, as it was called, much of that Tutsi aristocracy was sent packing from the country. They fled the country. A lot of them ended up in Uganda, neighbouring Uganda, because it just meant crossing the border. And you just mentioned that Kagame was 2 years old because he was carried there on the back of his mother, who was related to the Queen. And at one stage, the family thought that they were going to fall victim to these horrible ethnic pogroms that were taking place in Rwanda. They fled en famille into Uganda and lived in a series of refugee camps and settlements until they finally settled in a place called Gahunje in western Uganda.
Often when these revolutions happen, it's the wealthy that get away first. You mentioned that Kagame's family were quite wealthy and well connected. Were there poor Tutsis?
Yes, there certainly were. And this is one of the sort of interesting divisions. A lot of the aristocracy fled, but there was also the royal entourage. And behind them, they left many of the poorer Tutsis, who were sometimes known as les petits Tutsis or the Tutsis à l'intérieur. And they remained inside Rwanda and lived there. But the aristocracy was obviously a particular target. And for Kagame and his family and many of the people they knew, this was an incredibly humiliating experience. And I think that holds a key to his character today and also the way he functions. Because, Tutsis aren't meant to cultivate the soil. They're not meant to dig the ground. They are meant to have these beautiful herds of cattle. But of course, all of those were sacrificed as they headed across the border. There wasn't room for them to graze. They had to sell the cattle to sort of make ends meet. And so they end up becoming farmers, just like the Hutus back home. Kagame's father found that. He was a prosperous coffee broker. He found that incredibly humiliating and sort of became an alcoholic and bittered alcoholic, while his mother kind of rose to the challenge and became a very important member of the family. So Kagame grew up in this sort of feeling of being an outsider because local indigenous Ugandans, of course, knew who the arrivals were in the country, these Kinyarwanda speaking new arrivals. There's certainly a large community of Kinyarwanda speaking people inside Uganda who'd spent decades, sometimes centuries in the country. But these were new. They were regarded as aliens. They were outsiders. Local politicians didn't want them to take part in elections. People didn't want to give them jobs. There was a whole issue about whether or not they were allowed to own land, buy land. But land is always precious. And so if you're a young Tutsi Rwandan refugee, life was tough. And what you see is Kagame changing. I went to his old primary school in a place called Ruengoro and spoke to some of his former classmates. And they remembered someone who was almost a teacher's pet, very much a disciplinarian who liked to keep other children in his class, under control, reported bad behavior to the teacher. And then by the time he got to secondary school, by that stage he'd moved to the capital, to Kampala, he was falling out, having fights with other pupils, becoming a very aggrieved and unhappy, rebellious teenager, and ends up being a street hustler in Kampala. Sort of apparently he was trading sort of stolen travelers' checks, gold, just sort of making a living on the streets. But at this point, he was recruited by an old friend of his, someone called Fred Rwigema. And Rwigema, like him, was another Tutsi refugee who had also come over, he's slightly older, come over with his mother and his family and had grown up in the refugee camps. And Fred had been recruited into a guerrilla movement set up by Yoweri Museveni, the future president of Uganda. And Fred had gone to Mozambique with that guerrilla movement, had learned how to fight. And Kagame met him and sort of thought, wow, he's changed, he's become a grown-up. And Fred sort of said to him, join this guerrilla movement, because Fred knew that they were going to end up back in the bush again, fighting against the regime of Milton Obote.
There's a clear theme so far of resentfulness at the treatment of the Tutsis. As you've alluded to, the military has played an important role throughout Kagame's life, and he became eventually a military officer fighting on behalf of Yoweri Museveni. Did Museveni's cause offer a clear path to an end to that resentfulness, do you think? Or was this just a rebellious young man looking for something to fill his time?
I think you could see it as both things at the same time. He was a questing young man, rootless, who felt he'd been rejected by Ugandan society and didn't have much of a future there. And then he joined this guerrilla movement, which went into the bush in Luwero in 1981. And there he found military structure, military discipline, camaraderie of the other fighters, and also a cause that they were fighting to topple Milton Obote, and that this government that sort of was made largely of soldiers. The government army was made up of soldiers from the north. So I think it's interesting that the guerrilla movement was called the National Resistance Army. And it had a disproportionately large number of young men who were from this Banya-Rwanda community, like Kagame, like Fred Rwigema. And this is partly because Yoweri Museveni came from Western Uganda, and he had sort of seen this community. They were part of his upbringing. He'd seen them. He understood what made them tick. He knew that they had grievances, that there was an unhappiness there. And so he knew he could tap into that. But also, as time went by, and I don't think we know exactly when it started, but the young men, the young Banya-Rwanda who joined the NRA began to think, we're fighting to free Uganda from dictatorship. We will pick up in the NRA vital skills, battle skills. We'll learn how to handle a gun. We'll learn how to deploy and how to run a guerrilla movement, how to deploy across the terrain. And we can take those skills back to Rwanda, which they still felt was their homeland, and they still felt they had been, unfairly ejected from there. We'll take those skills back and we will recapture power in Rwanda. So there was a double agenda there as far as the Banya-Rwanda fighters were concerned.
It sounds like quite a transactional setup. I mean, Kagame ended up being quite a senior officer for Museveni's rebel forces. Museveni ultimately, by the mid-1980s, was sort of on the cusp of defeating Milton Obote's forces. How much of Museveni's success can we attribute to Kagame and other Rwandan Tutsis like him?
It's hard to pin down because Museveni himself was always after he seized control in 1986 and was sworn in as president, and a lot of these his rebel movement became Uganda's army, and a lot of the young Banya-Rwanda men who were within it then got senior positions. But Museveni didn't want to sort of give too much credit to them because it made it look like it was an outside, an alien force. So he always would downplay their importance in the NRA. But what interviewing former members of the NRA, what I was always told was that they were the best fighters. And it was partly because there was this feeling within that community that they had nothing to lose. They'd come from these refugee camps. They wanted eventually to go home. That was an agenda, by the way, that they kept secret. They kept to themselves. It wasn't openly discussed in the NRA. But that they were they had a sort of that added edge that made them really good fighters because they were willing to risk everything. Apart from the fact that they also came from a community that had this tradition of warrior, producing some incredibly impressive warriors. So I think they did contribute. They did play an important role.
And ultimately, I suppose Kagame got what he wanted in the sense that he, as you said, learnt from the Ugandans and learnt how to be a fighter and ultimately how to be a killer. But also, I suppose, I asked you earlier whether there was a route out of that resentfulness through fighting with the Ugandans. I suppose actually the stability itself was a sort of it was a catharsis probably that he hadn't had in his earlier life. When he ultimately returned to Rwanda, what sort of country did he find?
Can I interrupt you here? Because there's a detail that I haven't managed to
Yeah, please
mention.
go ahead.
Okay. I think I found it quite interesting talking to former NRA fighters, what they remembered and what they recalled of Kagame, and a nickname that they coined for him. It's important to know that Kagame was never somebody who did any really physical fighting. Yes, he was a guerrilla, but because he was regarded as an intellectual, he was used as an intelligence officer, and he often deployed behind enemy lines, and it was all about picking up information from local villages and then relaying it back to the NRA in the Luwero Triangle. But also he played another role, and I think it's significant because often, with a rebel movement, as in any army, there are issues of discipline. And Kagame was the guy who would be sent to collect information about a rebel, an NRA fighter, who was thought to have behaved badly or be out of control, be letting the side down. Maybe he'd taken a local village girl as a girlfriend. Maybe he was getting drunk in a local bar, saying things he shouldn't. And then that fighter would be court-martialed. And in some cases, quite a few cases, they would be executed because they represented a security threat. And the person who collected that information was Kagame. And because he played that role and because he appeared to relish it, he was known as Pilato. And that's a nickname that is based on Pontius Pilate in the Bible, who was responsible for trying Jesus and then washing his hands before the final sentence. And Kagame was seen as playing this rather punitive role and was therefore quite unpopular in NRA ranks. He was seen as effective, but he was much feared because he played this role of sort of snitching and collecting information that could then get people killed. And that reputation has clung to him throughout his life within the fighters of that generation.
That makes quite a lot of sense, because if you look at pictures of Kagame, he doesn't look like a soldier. He looks like a student, really. He's not very thick set. He's quite a thin man.
He's incredibly skinny. He's never had the best of health. He's got glasses, and in fact, former fighters who were at the front with him will sort of say, "Oh, he was hopeless in battle, and we always had to tell him where to go and what to do." So he was never a fighter. There were these groups of NRA guerrillas who played other roles. Some of them would become diplomats. Some of them were NRA doctors. The fighting was not the only role they had to play.
So if you think about this sort of intelligence type of leadership that Kagame had, what was the context back in Rwanda that he had to apply this to when he got back?
Well, what you see is in 1990, while Museveni was away at a UN meeting in New York, this group of fighters, Banya-Rwanda fighters who had been given positions in the Ugandan army, often in intelligence, they had been plotting for a long time. They had spent years waiting for this day. And what they had done is they had secreted away a whole bunch of munition, equipment. They had people placed in various units around the country. They were ready to go because they knew that if they were going to go back into Rwanda, invade Rwanda in this quest to recapture their homeland, they were going to need trucks, they were going to need ammunition, they were going to need uniforms, boots, all of those things. And they had prepared that. And so when Museveni was away, Fred Rijema gave the starting whistle, blew on the starting whistle, and people went into action, and the trucks and the weaponry and the men, they all just headed to the border with Rwanda, headed southwest, and went in across the border behind Fred Rijema, their charismatic, much-loved leader. And everything went wrong immediately. So by day 2, Fred Regime had been killed. We still don't really know the circumstances in which he died. There's talk of a stray bullet coming from the Rwandan army inside the country, which started fighting against this rebel invasion. But there's also talk of an internal coup within this movement, which had now given itself the name Rwandan Patriotic Front. There are these stories that these two ambitious lieutenants under Fred, who resented his control, had decided to take him out really early on in the invasion. Many of the people who had joined the RPF had joined because of Fred, because they believed in him. He had been this inspirational young leader during the NRA years in Uganda. He had then had a very, very senior positions within the Ugandan army. Museveni regarded him as the kind of surrogate son. He was seen as the golden boy. So when he was killed on day 2 of the invasion, suddenly the RPF falls into complete disarray. And then they started to be, completely slaughtered on the battlefield by the Rwandan army, and they have to retreat. And they end up splitting their forces and licking their wounds back in the Ruwenzori mountains. And that is when Kagame came to the fore, because Museveni, basically, from what I understand, Museveni wanted somebody he knew to be running the RPF, someone who he had worked alongside for years and years. So Kagame, who was in the States at the time, came back. He was on a training course, came back and took the leadership of the RPF. And I think what you see immediately is this change of style, change of leadership, because Fred, because he was adored by so many of the soldiers below him, the fighters, he never had to sort of exert himself too strongly. He didn't have to bully people. He didn't have to terrify them. They would just do things to please Fred. And instead, Kagame, who had been a very good friend of Fred's, he was sort of often the guy hovering behind Fred. Kagame was disliked. The Pilato nickname had stuck to him, and therefore he had to impose himself on a movement whose fighters regarded themselves as more experienced than him, better at fighting, didn't have much respect for this guy. And so he really was a very punitive leader. You can see that this is the Kagame flavor, and that flavor is, I may not be loved, but I will be feared.
Is fear, yeah. Obviously, despite the fact that Fred was very popular, he, as you said, hadn't been particularly successful in his attempt to sort of foment a counter-revolution within Rwanda. Despite the fact that Kagame was perhaps a less adored person, was he more successful in that endeavour?
Well, as you say, I think the RPF, as soon as it arrived in Rwanda, realised that this wasn't the country they had been talking about and thinking about and dreaming about during all those years in the refugee camps and at the front. There was a Hutu majority, a Hutu president, Juvenal Habyarimana, running the country, and there was this increasing toxic suspicion and hostility towards Tutsis, because by mere dint of invading the country, of course, the RPF had sort of made sure that the Rwandan army and the Hutu administration were on the back foot and felt very beleaguered. And also the RPF began to push people off the land, because as they advanced, of course, they didn't want peasants to stay put, because those peasants would then become possible informers on their movements. So they were pushing people off the land, and all those displaced Hutu villagers were ending up around Kigali, living in these really squalid refugee camps. And people were inside Rwanda were very worried about the possible imminent arrival of the RPF. And so you see the formation of extremist militias, the Interahamwe, as they were known, who kind of are operating independently of the Rwandan army, the Hutu-dominated army. And they're extremely, they've got this xenophobic anti-Tutsi rhetoric, and they feel that they're ready to defend their country from Tutsi infringement. So I think the RPF found itself dealing with a level of kind of popular hostility that they really hadn't catered for. What you see in the end is that yes, they make inroads. They do amazingly well, the RPF, and they end up holding a base just in a place called Mulindi. and they start having peace talks in Arusha with the Hutu administration, with the Hutu government, and with President Juvenal Habyarimana. So they've won themselves a place at the table. There's this sort of very interesting moment in Rwandan history. There are all these reformist Hutu politicians who aren't happy with the president either, and who are sort of contesting his rule. And then at that moment, when the peace talks are taking place, and the UN has dispatched peacekeepers to Rwanda, and they're talking about what share of the army will go to the RPF and what ministerial posts will go to the RPF, and all of this seems to be in the process of being sorted out. At that moment, a plane carrying the presidents of both Rwanda and Burundi is coming into land at Kigali, returning from Arusha, and it's shot down by a missile. And there's been a lot of discussion about who brought down the missile. I don't think it's possible to say for sure. You hear people who say it was Hutu extremists within Habyarimana's own administration. I've spoken to lots of former high-ranking members of the RPF who say, of course, we did it. We wanted to take Habyarimana out because we didn't want to power share with the Hutus. We wanted to seize control of the country. And so at that moment, the genocide begins, and you see ordinary Tutsis, the Tutsis à l'intérieur, the petit Tutsis being slaughtered in their hundreds of thousands, along with the Hutu reformist politicians on the streets, by these extremist militias.
Over the course of the next few months after the taking down of the plane carrying President Habyarimana, I think between 250,000 and 750,000 Tutsis and sort of moderate Hutus were murdered by the Hutu extremists. What effect do you think it's had on Kagame's view of the Hutus, ultimately?
I think it's left lasting scars because, there's this whole narrative that has been created by the RPF and that very much won over the whole of the international community, Western journalists, Western diplomats, heads of state, which is that you have this atrocity, this ghastly genocide carried out mostly by Hutu militiamen and members of the Hutu army, and most of their victims are Tutsis. And that memory of that slaughter is constantly invoked today by Kagame and by his entourage to justify him remaining in power and having this sort of tight grip on power, because the spectre of the genocide is constantly conjured up so that Kagame can say to the Tutsi minority, look, you may not like me, you may think that I'm a dictator, you may not like the way I have suppressed all form of a political challenge and a crackdown on the press, but if it weren't for me, you wouldn't even exist. You would have been wiped from the face of the earth. And if you don't let me continue to run the country, the Hutu majority will finish the job. And that's very obviously a sort of quiet message that is constantly put out by the elite, even while they constantly talk about ethnic reconciliation and while they've done away with the labels of Hutus and Tutsis, and everyone now in Rwanda calls themselves a Rwandan. It's very clear that threat is used, that potential, finish the genocide promise is invoked all the time by the administration.
Given the number of Tutsis that were murdered, I don't know proportionally, and I'd be interested to hear how many Tutsis were murdered as a proportion of the whole. But given the scale of the bloodshed, it's perhaps slightly surprising that they actually won.
Well, these was, firstly, I just have to say there's a massive controversy and debate that goes on about how many people were killed. And it's one I don't go into in my book because it's obviously an incredibly touchy subject. People feel very passionately and get very upset when they think, for example, that the number of victims is being minimized. But there's also clearly been an inflation of the figures. And you will sometimes hear people in the Tutsi elite talking about, 2 million people being killed, and you sort of think, I'm sorry, but there's absolutely no evidence of that. And also, of course, this the constant emphasis on the number of Tutsi dead ignores the fact that there, of course, were many, many thousands of Hutus who were killed by the RPF as they advanced across the country during the genocide by the RPF. As it ethnically cleansed areas that it wanted under its own control. And also later, after the new government had taken control, Hutu refugees who had fled into neighbouring Democratic Republic of Congo being slaughtered in their hundreds of thousands by the RPF, which had now become the Rwandan army. So the figures are both very controversial, but also the emphasis always tends to be placed on one side of the equation. And this is something that causes huge bitterness in the Hutu community, because every year in April, there are these commemorative events in which the victims of the genocide are rightly remembered. But the Hutu community says, well, why aren't we allowed ever, ever, ever to talk about our dead who were slaughtered by the RPF? And if you even mention that, for example, your grandfather or your uncle was killed by the RPF in 1994, you can be tried, you can be arrested, charged with genocide denial or divisionism or negationism. These are all legal concepts in Rwanda, and you can end up, and people do end up in jail. So there's a feeling that the figures are toxic, are laden with all sorts of political meaning and value. And there is also, for example, this terminology that the government insists upon, in which they will talk about the genocide of the Tutsis. So I've been talking to you about the genocide, and if I was somebody who wanted to keep sweet with the government in Kigali, I would every time have said the genocide of the Tutsis, because they say that's the correct term, because genocide means one ethnic group is targeted for extermination. But of course, in saying the genocide of the Tutsis, they also are leaving out of the equation and the discussion the many, many dead who happen to be members of the Hutu majority.
When the RPF ultimately came to power in 1994, you sort of mentioned the idea of kind of recriminations against the Hutus. I was going to ask you about the fact that obviously there hasn't been a sort of like another genocide since of Hutus after the terrible genocide of largely of the Tutsis, but as you've said of Hutus as well in 1994. It does sound though as if there have been other forms of recrimination against the Hutus. You talk a lot in your book Do Not Disturb about the themes of kind of duplicity and lying. Do you think this is the source of that? This kind of slightly botched memory of what actually happened in 1994?
I think when I was thinking about my book, I think I must have used the word narrative in my book about 1 million times, because it became very clear to me that I was talking about conflicting narratives, clashing narratives. And that's why in my introduction, controversially, I talk about these concepts of ubwenje, which is a Kenya-Rwanda word for wisdom, but it can also mean cunning. And I also talk about intwari, which is quality of sort of hiding your emotions, aloofness, not expressing yourself. It's the sort of Rwandan equivalent of the English stiff upper lip. And I talk about that as being sort of Rwandan traits. And it seemed to me important to mention these qualities, because what I found as a researcher was that people were constantly telling me and warning me, and this would be Rwandans speaking to me, and they would say, oh, but you must realize, I hope you're aware that Rwandans always lie. And I sort of thought that's such a bizarre thing for people to say about their own culture. I mean, which other country in the world would say, well, you have to understand, we're all liars, madame, or be careful about talking for so-and-so, he's the liar. And then they would add this extra rider. They would say, and Rwandans particularly enjoy deceiving or taking outsiders for a ride, Westerners for a ride. I wanted to sort of talk about that in my book because my book really focuses on former members of the RPF elite, the former head of external intelligence, the former head of the armed forces, the former head of the party secretary general of the RPF, the former prosecutor general, who had all fallen out with Kagame and fled abroad. And these were men who I met in their prime when they were, defending Kagame, championing the RPF project, and telling me the story about how the RPF had come in and had miraculously put an end to this ghastly slaughter staged by the Hutu. And they'd missed out all of these other elements of the fact that also the RPF had been indulging in atrocities and ethnic slaughter and may or may not have played a role in downing the jet that triggered the genocide. And then later, when I met them and was interviewing them after they'd fled the country and denounced their old mate, their personal friend, Paul Kagame, they were suddenly saying to me, everything we told you was a lie. And yes, we did bring down the plane. And yes, we did, we did conduct atrocities. And yes, we did this. Yes, we did that. All the opposite of what they had said when I had met them as a journalist in 1994 and afterwards. So I had to sort of confront that issue. And I think, this really goes to the heart of Rwandan culture, which I think is probably rooted in the way the royal court used to operate, which is that it was extremely insular, it was very inward looking, it was very secretive, and it didn't like to reveal itself to outsiders. There was always this sort of, the Rwandan court never wanted any colonial infiltration or into Rwanda in the 19th century. They were very resistant to that. So yes, I think the story of Rwanda is a story of conflicting narratives. And now, the narrative that holds good in Rwanda is the one that the RPF has adopted. People like me who've been following things there since the 1990s are no longer convinced by that narrative. But it has to be said that Kagame has been extremely successful at persuading, much of the Western world to accept it. And the narrative is, there was this ghastly slaughter. I ended the genocide. I am owed deep thanks, not only by my own people, but by the international community for having ended this atrocity.
It's funny, I was reading your book alongside a book called Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. I don't know if you've read it, but it's about the troubles in Northern Ireland and the sort of the theme that you pull out of lying and conflicting narratives struck a real chord very strongly with what Radden Keefe talks about in going on in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s. If we look at Rwanda after 1994, Kagame served as vice president from 1994 until 2000. Given that he had been so prominent in the RPF before 94, why did he feel the need to seemingly be a power behind the throne and not be a figurehead? Is this something that can be reflected in the fact that he's, an academic, intellectual, almost like a school prefect?
No, I think it was very simple. The RPF, when it came in, was very aware that it would be seen as the Tutsis taking back control, the Tutsi aristocracy. And that would be something that the Hutu majority, who had thrown out the royal court, would both resent and fear. And so before they seized power in 1994, they had already reached out to Hutu reformist Hutu politicians who were, campaigning fighting against Juvenal Habyarimana's regime. They had recruited them. They had appointed as RPF chairman a Hutu, and when it came to doling out ministerial jobs, they made sure that there were Hutus in key posts, including, for example, Seth Sendashonga, a very prominent, much respected Hutu politician who took the role of interior minister. The prime minister was also a Hutu, Faustin Twagiramungu, and the president was Pastor Bizimungu, a Hutu, former successful businessman. So it was all about reassuring the Hutu majority, it's Tutsi, this is a Tutsi-dominated rebel group, but don't worry, This isn't going to be, we're not out to kind of target your community. We understand about power sharing. We understand that, we cannot sort of, claim all the goodies and all the power and all the ministerial portfolio. So it was about sending out a reassuring message. And the sad reality was that as the years went by, Kagame was always the power behind the throne and always made the key decisions. And he made sure he undermined all of those Hutu politicians so that they all ended up going into exile, apart from Bizimungu, who still lives in Rwanda. They ended up fleeing into exile. Seth Sendashonga was assassinated, almost certainly by the RPF in Nairobi. And then, Kagame just kind of formalizes what everyone knew, which is that he's running the show in 2000 by making himself president.
In that time as vice president, Rwanda became involved in two wars in the Congo, backing certain rebel groups. How did those sides fare? And in a sense, it's a bit of it seems like a bit of an odd thing to do after this terrible convulsive episode inside Rwanda in 1994 that just in a mere few years, Kagame and co decide to sort of launch themselves into another conflict.
Yes, it's amazing, really, when you think about it, given what had happened inside Rwanda. There were some security issues because what had happened is that as the RPF marched into the country and eventually sent the government and its national army packing, there was this extraordinary flood of Hutus into neighbouring countries, into Burundi, Tanzania, and Zaire, as it was then known. And I covered that as a journalist, and it was like a big biblical exodus because the army and the militias, the former army of Habyarimana, went through the villages saying to everybody, okay, the RPF has won, but we will clear the country. It will be ruling over an empty country. And so they deliberately, and also people were genuinely terrified of the RPF because they had heard about the atrocities and the ethnic cleansing that had taken place in northern Rwanda, and they thought the same thing would happen to them. So they fled into neighbouring countries, over 2 million people on the move, and then set up right on the border. They set up these refugee camps, UNHCR goes in, WFP went in. And the trouble was that there was the army had left in large numbers, taken as many weapons as they could. So had the extremist militias. And they immediately started training in those camps, preparing to counterattack Rwanda and seize back control of the country. And it was, the international community was conveniently feeding and watering them. So they had plenty of time to get ready for their counterattack. So, yeah, and they did start to attack, and there were all sorts of nasty incidents, and sort of, buses being stopped in Western Rwanda, and people made to get off the bus, and then everyone who was a Tutsi would be killed, and only the Hutus would be spared, and schools were attacked. So the new government's hold was on the Western country was looking quite shaky. So there was this desire to clear those camps and get rid of those camps. And since the UN wasn't doing anything about moving this huge number of people, and the Congolese army went either, at a certain stage, the Rwandans got moving and set up. They got up together a bunch of former Congolese rebels and basically created the AFDL, as it was known, which ended up marching across Zaire and toppling President Mobutu Sese Seko. So it started off as a security concern, but quite clearly, with the passage of the years, Rwanda, which is asset poor and doesn't have any wonderful mineral resources and is very small and overpopulated, and depends on subsistence agriculture, began to eye up the goodies that were very obviously on display in neighbouring DRC, the timber, the precious stones, the coltan, the oil, all of these goodies that were there for the taking in their view, because they sort of thought, well, this is the world's most useless army. I mean, Mobutu's army was famously chaotic, ill-disciplined, predatory, and hated by the local population. So the AFDR, with its Rwandan friends, as they went into DRC, wiping out as many of the Hutu members of the Hutu extremists and Hutu army as they could along the way, and also killing Hutu refugees, civilians alongside them, they also began to sort of think, well, we can benefit from this. And there you get this long history of predatory kind of commercial exploitation going hand in hand with military intervention.
Kagame ultimately became president in 2000. What was the catalyst for his sort of overtaking of Bizimungu?
I think it was just that he felt the time had come. I think during those years you see him flexing his muscles, sizing up the situation, beginning to marginalize people who stand in his way, and also Kagame beginning to make it clear to those around him that he's the boss, and he doesn't see why he should take a back seat, even if it's just nominally.
Kagame's regime since 2000 has been highly authoritarian, and it treats its enemies either in the media or within politics and within the intelligence community very brutally. Your book, Do Not Disturb, which I've mentioned a couple of times, details a particularly unpleasant episode with the murder of Patrick Karegeya in South Africa. Can you just tell people a bit about that event and what you think it tells us about Kagame's character and the type of regime that he's built up?
I mean, my book starts with that incident in which Patrick Karegeya, who had been with Kagame, he'd actually been to school with Kagame. I mean, they went that far back. And then he had been in the NRA, just like Kagame had. He had also been an intelligence officer. And then, like Kagame, he had joined the Ugandan army. And then he hadn't gone across into Uganda in 1990 with Kagame and Fred, but he had sort of acted as the guy who stays behind and liaises and makes sure that they got supplies and ammunition. And so he'd been the sort of key point person back in Kampala as the RPF was probing into Rwanda. So eventually he was made head of external intelligence. Very, very powerful job inside Rwanda, and he moved there. He was very interesting. Patrick Karegeya was somebody who hung out with journalists a lot. He was a bit like the Alistair Campbell of the regime because he was very charming, he was funny, he was irreverent, and he used to sort of explain this rather diffident, prickly, seemingly very shy leader that was Paul Kagame. He would explain what was going on and why they were doing what they were doing. But at a certain stage, he fell out with Kagame and he ended up under house arrest. And then he went quite a long stint in jail for insubordination. And then he was warned that his life was in danger and he fled to South Africa and sat there with nothing much to do until he was joined there by the head of the armed forces, General Kayumba Nyamwasa, another key man during the RPF invasion of Rwanda, someone who had really kind of allowed Kagame to seize control of the country, a key military figure, much admired by his troops. And he ends up being told he's given a sort of unimportant job in India. Then when he comes back for his mum's funeral, he is told by his comrades in the RPF, your life is in danger. You need to leave the country. You need to get out of here because Kagame is coming for you. And so he ends up in South Africa as well. He flees the country, ends up in South Africa as well. And by that stage, there are so many of these Tutsi insiders, members of the RPF, who used to be very close to Kagame, who are just sort of thinking, we didn't fight in the RPF. We didn't go through all of that trauma and suffering to set up this society where elections are rigged, the opposition leaders are routinely in jail and prevented from running for elections. Everything is focused and centered in the president's hands. And so Kayumba Karegeya, the former prosecutor general Gerald Gahima, and former head of the RPF, the General Secretary, Theogene Rudasingwa, they set up an opposition party called the Rwanda National Congress, in which they say, tellingly, things now in Rwanda are worse than they were under Habyarimana. And that's extraordinary for a group of Tutsi former top insiders from the RPF to be saying that. a situation that's so often presented to the outside world as we are this Tutsi minority and we are beleaguered and surrounded by hostile Hutu majority forces. These guys weren't having it, and they were sort of saying, no, that's not what's happening. And these guys were Tutsis and key members of the RPF. So, it's when that whole narrative kind of begins to show these gaping holes and become extremely unconvincing, in my view.
Kagame was murdered in, I think, 2015?
It was 2014. It was January 2014. Yeah, he was strangled in a hotel room. He had gone there to see a friend, a Hutu businessman who it's quite clear with the passage of the years that this man, he was a friend of Patrick Karegeya, and it's sort of obvious that he was used as a decoy. And this is where, you see Kagame's background and intelligence coming to the fore, because, what Kagame's always been very good at doing is sort of setting up stings, setting up traps into which his enemies fall. And this, Rwanda has rightly been described by Freedom House, the American lobby group, as one of the worst perpetrators of transnational repression. China does that routinely. Russia, we know, does that. It's done that here in the UK. Turkey does that. Saudi Arabia does that. But in Africa, the only country that does that in a really, really systematic way is Rwanda. And so, when they sent a squad to kill Patrick Karegeya in that hotel room, and they also attempted to shoot General Kayumba. I've interviewed General Kayumba, and he has a bullet in the bottom of his back. It's still lodged there; it can't be removed because he survived a shooting. He survived a series of multiple attacks on him.
That's just a real insecurity to Kagame's grip on power. Is that real? Is that demonstrable, or is that simply paranoia, do you think?
I think it's hard to know. I think often there's a message about these attacks that on the one hand, Kagame is taking out a perceived enemy or trying to take out a perceived enemy. But it's also about the fear and dismay it sows within any possible opposition forces within the country. And Kagame has said this explicitly, repeatedly on public stages. He will sort of say, wherever you go, I will find you.
You detail all this brilliantly. But when Do Not Disturb came out last year, you must have been slightly frustrated that in spite of all of this terrible stuff that Kagame does, the way he treats his opponents, he still has fanboys all across the Western world in the important capitals. What is Kagame's relationship like with Washington and with London and with Brussels? And you must feel a certain frustration. You must feel like banging your head against it.
No, I certainly do. I mean, I was tearing my hair out earlier this year when Priti Patel unveiled her asylum seekers project. The idea that we would be sending unwanted asylum seekers from the UK to settle in Rwanda, a country which is actually the most overpopulated country in Africa, which already has 250,000 refugees living in tented camps. We're going to be sending our unwanted migrants there. That seems really appropriate. Yeah, sure. Great idea. So, sometimes you just sort of think that nothing will shift this narrative, that people are very lazy. They don't want to, they've convinced themselves this is the story of Rwanda, as this miraculous, rising from the ashes story, enlightened leadership, development miracle. This narrative works because we allow it to work here in the West. We want it to work.
People want to believe it.
Yeah, we want to believe it for a variety of reasons. One is that there was this residual guilt complex in the international community because no one in the international community did anything to stop the genocide as it was taking place. We actually, the UN actually withdrew peacekeepers, at a key moment. So there's guilt, and Kagame is very good at playing the guilt card. Then I think a very important element, which tends to go a bit neglected, is the way in which the development community, the development industry, and that involves NGOs, but also, development ministries, organizations like DFID, which now has been subsumed into the Foreign Office, there's a whole industry built around foreign aid in the West, and it is desperate for success stories in Africa. And up until now, and I would say still now, it's very difficult to find them. And there are plenty of people like me who say, well, aid is actually encouraging both corruption and dictatorship, because we're propping up regimes that aren't that popular with their local voters, and we're just kind of continue funding them and actually have become complicit in all the nastiness that they commit. So there's been this real drive, this need to identify a success story, and Kagame has known how to market Rwanda brilliantly as a success story, focusing on all the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and sort of making sure that all these boxes can be ticked. I personally think that all those boxes aren't being ticked, that aid has been put to good use in Rwanda, but not miraculous use. And if my book goes into it in some detail. If you look at each statistic carefully, you'll see that often they've been massively inflated and they can't be trusted at all. And also, Kagame's been really clever at playing this security card. So there are plenty of places in Africa at the moment where jihadism is an issue. That's been true of Central African Republic, and we've seen this in Mozambique, where this massive gas installation had to be closed down. Total had to close it down because there was a jihadi uprising there. So Kagame steps up to the plate immediately and offers peacekeeping troops for all these places, an offer which is gratefully taken up by the West, which doesn't want to send Western soldiers to these places. And it's something very deeply ironic, because as Kagame is offering himself up as Africa's policeman, he's actually also funding, arming, and providing fighters for the M23 rebel group in Eastern Congo, which is creating hundreds of thousands of Congolese refugees and disrupting the whole of Eastern Congo. And now, of course, in Britain, because we're counting and hoping that Rwanda will take these asylum seekers, no word of that will ever be mentioned, and all we have to say about Rwanda are really nice things. And overall, Paul Kagame knows how to play the West. He does it absolutely brilliantly, and we fall for it every time.
Yes, I mean, this sort of line that is often trotted out by people that Kagame, well, he's not a pleasant leader, far from it, but if you take 1994 as your starting point and the horror of the genocide, and that's not that long ago, it's worth saying, but lots of people would say, okay, well, Kagame's not perfect, but he's stable, and that's tolerable. It sounds that he is, yes, in some senses, installing a degree of stability within Rwanda, but outside it's just absolute chaos.
Well, firstly, I think the whole premise of that sort of presentation is questionable, because it's as though there was a big mess and then Kagame and the RPF came in and sorted it out. And it's kind of like, no, the RPF and Kagame helped create that mess, that genocide. They played the role in bringing it about simply by dint of invading Rwanda. They helped ensure that relations between, Hutus and Tutsis which were already toxic, became absolutely poisonous. And then that culminated when the plane came down. So I think that's a false reading of history, but to address your main point, there are two problems. One is, the question is, has ethnic reconciliation taken place, or is there any sign it's really taking place in a serious way? And what's the future? What does the future hold? So I would argue that ethnic reconciliation hasn't taken place. It's very hard to know what an ordinary Hutu citizen in Rwanda thinks today, because it's not as though the press is free. There's such a sense in that country that people have of being monitored, watched, reported on, even by the next door neighbours, that it would take a very foolhardy person to express any open criticism of Kagame or the RPF. But I think it's sort of, you can sort of guess how the Hutu majority feels every year in April, when there are these endless commemorations of the genocide going on, in which everyone is asked to commemorate the dead, but no one dare mention that some of those dead were actually of Hutu ethnicity and not Tutsi. And the kind of a sense of deep resentment and anger that would create, and the awareness also that key spots, key powerful positions in the administration, in the military, are on the whole, not always, but on the whole, held by Tutsis. So there's that. But then just to go back to the measure of success is if it's sustainable. And what you're getting in Rwanda, and it's the same thing in Uganda, is no one can imagine a post-Kagame period, because all of the people who have been cleansed from the government, some of them were potential challengers. The opposition is in jail and won't become, anyone who sort of openly campaigns against the government ends up being in jail at key moments when they would like to stand, maybe in an election. So it's really hard to see where this is going. Will Kagame hand over to a member of his own family eventually? Or will he designate someone? I suspect he'll cling on to the very end. I think Museveni will do the same in Uganda. So that raises all sorts of questions, because this is a country where power is really, really focused in one man's hands. And the West tends to get very excited about certain, institutions being set up that nominally have independence. And the trouble is, if you look at those institutions and their history, you'll see that the institutions that set up often with huge encouragement and funding from the international community, and then they are systematically neutered and emasculated by the ruling regime. So, it's only stable now. It may not be stable as soon as Kagame dies. And as you were saying, it's not stable. It's not a stabilizing influence on the region. Rwanda has been at war with Uganda inside Congolese territory in the past. It's come close to war recently. It's supporting the M23 rebel movement in Congo, which is devastating Eastern Congo. The Burundian president's accused Kagame of being behind an attempt to overturn him, a military coup attempt. So it depends how you define stability. I would say on most indices that he has not delivered it.
Just on a sort of final thought, the comparisons with Vladimir Putin abound here. I think, and it's something I urge people to think about as they go away. The sort of foreign killings, the conjuring up of a stability that's actually quite transient and quite whimsical. Michaela, thank you very much. That was a really interesting and a great sort of scope view of Rwanda. I've mentioned your book, but why don't you give it a plug and tell people where they can get it as a parting gift?
Anywhere. Buy it on Amazon. A lot of bookshops have it. I'm always delighted when I see it on the shelves in Waterstones or Foyles or anywhere really. And I think one of the nicest things for me is that it sells in African airport bookshops because of course you can't buy it in Rwanda, it's not on sale, and even in Uganda it's really hard to get hold of because it's considered to be such a controversial book. But when I hear from African readers and they're saying, where can I get your book? I sort of say, well, if you fly, or if you have a friend who flies or travels, you can usually get it in any airport bookshop. And also, the other thing is it's very nice that there's an ebook. So if people can download ebooks, then they can just get it straight off the Amazon page or straight off the Fourth Estate page.
Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.